podcast includes commentary and conversations about issues relevant to clinical psychology. It is intended to educate, entertain, and enlighten, and is not a substitute for actual mental health treatment. Individuals who share personally here choose willingly to tell their stories to benefit you, the listener. All other references to clinical situations are altered or limited to protect confidentiality. For more specific questions or help with a personal situation, please consult a local mental health professional. Therapy, mental health, real life. This is Psych Rally with Los Angeles-based clinical psychologist Dr. Martin Hsia.
Okay, Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome back to Psych Rally, where we talk about all things psychology, psychotherapy, mental health. We're on to episode 31 today, first episode of 2018, and I wanted to kind of debrief here from a conference I attended recently called the Evolution of Psychotherapy. And this just happened recently here, right before the holidays in mid-December in Anaheim, California, right across from the happiest place on earth, self-proclaimed. And just want to share some thoughts and reflections from it. If you were there, if you're a fellow mental health professional, if you've ever attended in previous years, then you're familiar with the size and scope of this conference, which it's a big deal. It essentially goes on for almost a whole week. It draws really the biggest names in our field as lecturers and presenters on the faculty. It takes up the whole convention center in Anaheim down there, along with another, I'd say 7 or 8 major ballrooms of the 2 adjacent hotels. And this year was attended by 7,500 people. So it's a big deal. And it's kind of like the Olympics or the World Cup in our field. It happens every 4 years only. So I was really glad to be able to go this year to hear, again, some really engaging and big name speakers and lectures. But another reason I was really glad to be there was to spend a couple days with my good friend and our guest today, who's a psychiatrist practicing in the Redondo Beach, California area. He is Dr. Joseph Lee. Dr. Lee, welcome and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And so he's Joey colloquially to me. So, but if you're a patient of his, I guess he'll prefer Dr. Lee. I don't know. You can determine that yourself. One of the things that make Dr. Lee unique as a psychiatrist is that even though as a physician he is trained and authorized to prescribe psychiatric medication, he's very much, if not pretty much completely shifted his philosophy and his practice to being a therapist, which if you're not in the field is extremely and increasingly rare for physicians and psychiatrists at this point in time. So that's something that I respect about Joey. He's also a very prolific and gifted writer and speaker. He talks about all kinds of things on his website, mentalhealthiness.com, where he speaks authoritatively on everything from parenting to anger management and emotion regulation, neuroscience, empathy, science fiction, a lot of really good things. I don't know if I was supposed to mention that. Anything else that you want to highlight real quick, Joey, about your public and professional life?
No, I think that covers it. Thank you very much. That was very, very, very nice.
Okay. All right. Good. And on a more personal note, we Joey and I have got to know each other pretty well this year. Mainly, I won't say too much about it, but through overlapping social media circles. And one thing that's pretty funny about Joey is that he has this way of like kind of in our overlapping social circles inviting mystery and conspiracy. There's this debate that is about whether he's actually Chinese or Korean, which has a perhaps more of a complex answer to that than is necessary. And then there's even this weird rumor that he and I are actually not two distinct Chinese-American mental health professionals practicing in Southern California, but we're actually the same person parading around as doppelgangers. It kind of Tyler Durden-esque personal
Right.
reality. So I don't know how we're going to get our friends to let go of that one.
They won't.
They won't. That's
let
right.
go.
Sure. So in any case, if I ever doubted that myself, which I haven't, that was dispelled when we actually met in person at this conference and spent a few days together. Joey, let's we both have some things to talk about. Do you want to share briefly kind of what one of the major highlights or things that you learned from the conference were?
Yeah, so this was actually my third Evolution of Psychotherapy conference that I went to. The first time I went to it was 8 years ago. And the first time I went was actually a pretty great sort of experience for me. As you mentioned before, it's probably the world's sort of largest psychotherapy conference. And so it was the first time where I actually heard a lot of very prominent and well-known therapists speak at that conference 8 years ago. So, that was the first time I heard Dan Siegel speak, Otto Kernberg, Marshall Linehan, just a lot of people, Salvador Minuchin, Aaron Beck. So I think what was interesting about that particular conference was that, you actually heard so many therapists coming from different backgrounds in terms of their area of expertise and focus. And you can kind of like, as an attendee, see where things overlap in terms of what they all believe is super important relative to the success of therapy. And then you can also sort of hear the different ways in which they believe this is an important focus, and and whereas they, like low key would sort of put down their colleagues. And that was kind of interesting. But the most impressionable part of that was, I think, Dan Siegel, hearing him speak for the first time. You mentioned that it's pretty rare for a psychiatrist to kind of be so psychotherapy oriented. And so Dan Siegel is, also a psychiatrist like myself, but comes from a perspective that is very oriented towards, people, relationships, therapy. And so that was pretty eye-opening and validating for me. And then he's also kind of pretty nerdy, which aligns with my personality style. So just folding in neuroscience and things like that. So that was a pretty big deal 8 years ago. And then 4 years ago was a pretty good experience too, in the context of like emerging themes, a lot more maybe emphasis on relationships, human connectedness. And I don't know if that just kind of emerged out of the fact that the world had become maybe more digital and more online. And then so somehow this like larger meta theme had popped out of the conference 4 years ago. And then this year I was eagerly anticipating again, just because it was such a meaningful learning experience. It always is whenever I attend, kind of like challenges me. Yeah. And so this year, again, I didn't kind of know what to expect, but a couple of highlights, I talk a lot about emotions, and a lot of that foundational work comes from Paul Ekman. And so he was a keynote speaker along with his daughter, Eve Ekman. And so I had an opportunity to go to one of these longer sort of talks between the two of them. And that was pretty great.
Right.
And then Esther Perel, I think this was the first time I've kind of was exposed to her work extensively, and that was a pretty good and eye-opening sort of experience. I think she spoke 7 times, and I probably like 4 or 5 of them, which is kind of what I end up doing. If somebody makes an impression on me, I try to like go to as many talks as they give, and so
you become the ultimate therapist groupie, right? Spend the whole week following one person.
Yeah, that's kind of like a creepy way to put it, but sort of.
So let's talk about Esther Perel, because I think you're not alone there. It was my first time hearing her speak live, and a number of people that we were in dialogue with where I kept saying like, oh my gosh, have you heard Esther Perel? You got to go hear her. So, and she really did do a great job. What really stood out to you about, or what did you take from her talks?
Yeah, so her area of expertise is specifically, I think, relationships. She's primarily a like couples therapist, right? But she kind of more recently became famous because a couple of TED Talks that she gave about relationships. She talks about sexuality, and sort of in this moment in time, she's kind of maybe the only prominent person talking about infidelity from a level of expertise in the context of helping couples. And so her first book, Mating in Captivity, I think is kind of what she's primarily known for. Right. And then now, sort of in the context of this conference, I think it was built around her expertise, not just in relationships, but specifically infidelity. So that's Esther Perel. And actually, the first few talks, I think she was building towards that final talk on infidelity, which was sort of like the last talk she gave on the second to last day, which is the big 3-hour talk. So most of her talks prior to that hadn't touched upon it, but she would reference and say, I'll get into those details more in the keynote. But I just found her in general, she just had, so much wisdom about, a lot of things, therapy, couples therapy. And she was like one of the very few people that was given an opportunity to talk about things like um, masculinity, femininity, and how that comes into
Right.
therapy. She talked about, one of her talks was talking about the art of psychotherapy, but she talked about things like cross-cultural perspectives, from that. And again, one of the few times that anybody sort of brought that up. And she spoke regarding these things with such a level of expertise and almost like casual expertise that she'd be like dropping these little
nuggets of wisdom and history.
Pearls of wisdom, and then people would spontaneously applause, because it was both wise and I think rare. I think that was the other, and I think we'll get to this. I think that was the other sort of experience that I think many attendees probably started to pick up on, which is when you heard anyone speak in more specific terms about certain groups of people, whether that's, different race groups or gender issues or issues regarding people who are gay or trans. It was so rare that to kind of hear anybody speak about it was sort of like this moment where you had to acknowledge it, and I think we'll get to that. But but that's actually another thing about her, how she just kind of casually talked about it, how important it was to validate a whole person's identity. And so I think that was actually pretty impressionable. And then the very nuanced and complex sort of final talk she gave on infidelity was very, very challenging, eye-opening. It's and so I think that was a huge impression. There's a lot to unpack there. I'll probably ultimately have to read her book to kind of get all the details, but it was actually pretty great.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one thing that really just stood out in the way that she put it when I heard her speak was basically saying that, first of all, she has veered away from calling herself a marriage therapist and calling herself a relationship therapist, right? Because, definitions of marriage are changing. The structure of the way people have long-term committed relationships is changing. Expectations on gender and on partnerships is changing more so than in any other kind of relationship, parent-child, work-related or otherwise, right? And she really kind of put that within a historical context, like, marriage was mainly an economic arrangement or structure not that long ago, but it's only in recent times with the romantic idea of marriage and with the way that society's changing now, it puts just a lot of systemic strain if not navigated appropriately or not understood in context. So I thought that was very insightful.
Yeah, that was, I think that was actually the first time I heard her to where she was on this, she spoke together with Marilyn Yalom, who is a feminist author, historian, and that was actually a great sort of like pairing between the historical perspective from, Marilyn Yalom kind of given the background and Esther Perel very seamlessly coming in. And sort of giving maybe the more therapeutic clinical sort of side as to how that history impacts why we as therapists need to evolve in our thinking regarding marriage, couples, relationships, towards what's really happening in the here and the now and how it's different. And we can't just look back 30 years and say, well, this is how they did couples therapy 30 years ago, because there's so many things that just are no longer the same in the society in which we live.
For sure. So shared thumbs up for Esther Perel.
Absolutely.
I wanted to share a little bit about Aaron Beck. Now, he only gave one talk. I mean, he's and by the way, Aaron Beck really considered a forefather in the world of cognitive therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, and he's elderly. He's 96. He's been at it for a long time. He's a real trooper, legend in the field. And he wasn't able to make the trip out to California from Philadelphia, so he teleconferenced in. You and I watched it together. But he's sharp. He talked, and he's 96. But he spoke live by video conference in front of a crowd of however many 7,000 people. And one of the things I thought was really interesting is there's that criticism in the field of cognitive therapy, cognitive behavior therapy as kind of being, simplistic or reductionist or not having a holistic or nuanced view of the human being and the process of therapy. And so his daughter Judith, also a psychologist and speaker at this event, fielded some questions from the audience. And one question that she shared for him to respond to live was, what do you have to say, Dr. Beck, about the association of cognitive behavioral therapy with manualized treatments and manualized therapies for patients? And I really appreciated his response. He basically said, therapy is a human process. Manuals think human suffering are, about techniques, and so they go from one step to another. But true cognitive therapy is a holistic approach and is really built on the foundation of a relationship with a patient and deals with problems as they come up. So you can't fit a person into a manual. It's a personal interaction, and human beings cannot be manualized. And so in some ways that wasn't surprising for me to hear, but it might have been for some other people who have that view of cognitive behavior therapy. And I just thought that was very significant to hear straight from, such a titan in the field of therapy and cognitive behavior therapy to say, hey, that's not all it is. You can apply it that way, but that's not really certainly his view, or straight from the mouth of a big name in cognitive behavior therapy, the view of that orientation.
Right. I think Aaron Beck, I think people, if they don't know sort of his personal history, he came out of psychoanalysis himself.
Right.
His background is that he was part of that group of, psychoanalysts, and sort of only the story is, I think, pretty almost as many things in the history of scientific discovery accidentally, or sort of people are compelled to improvise, some new solution. And so I think his personal background kind of never really illustrates that. I don't think he ever left or could independently separate himself from the idea of what maybe psychodynamic psychotherapy always sort of brings, which is the understanding of how a person's history, their personality, and their sort of humanness is always brought into the moment. So I think, when you hear him speak, yeah, absolutely. He even gave very specific examples of talking about how, cognitive therapy is applied to schizophrenia. And I think in that way, almost more compelling, the idea, because a lot of his sort of illustrations and examples is that the way that they were able to pull a lot of people back into this sort of like therapeutic relationship was connecting with some very human element of the patients in these inpatient units who on the outside were completely psychotic and seemed very disconnected. But then when talking about sort of very specific things, about human connection or desire to have, a relationship, then that kind of like really opened up things in the context of cognitive therapy, which is still, that modality, but it was connecting with something very, very human and very personal. Sure. That actually made the therapy work. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think that was great to hear from him directly.
Yeah, and it's so funny. You probably, probably both of us have this experience, and a lot of people that we know in the field, sort of like the more that you practice over time and spend years in a career as a therapist, you really start to see and appreciate in more nuanced ways how all the different approaches and orientations are really saying similar things. Maybe just using different language and having slightly different emphases, but are really not as incompatible as sometimes you may be led to believe. And I think, Beck's talk helped me just in a different way appreciate that. Again, here it is straight from him that, he's not saying cognitive behavior therapy is just about a manual or some linear, simplistic process. So that was very meaningful to me.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of that experience I had that first time I went to the Evolution of Psychotherapy conference. I think sometimes the individual experts they're so in their own lane that they themselves don't see it. But when you step back and you're not sort of that connected to that specific modality, and you're open to kind of hearing all the experts, then it becomes relatively clear that there's a lot of important and meaningful overlap. And like you said, maybe they all have different language or words to describe, what we call the alliance between the therapist and the client, or, connecting to emotion and why that's important, how the past is important. There are definitely these themes in therapy, I think, that are always relevant,
Right.
To any successful outcome. But yeah, maybe the specific experts in their field use their own language. And sometimes I think those experts feel like it's like some sort of exclusive discovery. But most of the time, I think the sort of super important and influential aspects of therapy are universally shared. And they're not particularly surprising when you kind of break it down. I think everyone can kind of understand, the
Right.
therapist has to validate the person's worldview. The therapist has to have a positive, trusting relationship,
Right.
The trust that the therapy is going to work.
Sure.
People have to keep coming back. Those are the kind of universal themes.
Right. And I think it's just frustrating when it's probably more outliers than most people, more the minority, I should say, that some people are just very outspoken and vociferous that one way of doing things is the right way and other ways are problematic or dangerous or wrong, if you will. I mean, it sort of feels more like politics when it comes to theoretical orientation debates, but perhaps in practice, most people are much more integrative in our views and practice as it is. You mentioned sort of how emotions are an essential part of therapy, which has been pretty intuitive and pretty natural. The Paul and Eve Ekman were also very integral with this conference, and they're big experts on the field of emotion. You wanted to mention some of your impressions from their talk.
Yeah, so Paul Ekman is the American psychologist that kind of basically created or legitimized maybe the scientific study of emotion. So I think it's pretty commonplace these days for us to at least understand this idea of emotional intelligence or EQ. And so that's kind of like, I think, integrated into our general culture of understanding that that's a thing and that's important. But so the background of that is really Paul Ekman kind of did a lot of research and experiments in the areas of human emotion. And what he kind of established is that regardless of where you are in the world, what culture you come from, first world, third world, that as a human being, we all experience emotions, and that there's something pretty kind of hardwired into us where we understand the emotions that we experience ourselves, and we understand them when other people are expressing them. And so that's kind of who Paul Ekman is. Eve Ekman is his daughter. So I heard them kind of speak together on a panel, and they talked about some of that history that I just outlined, and how they're able to come to some of these core tenets of emotions research. And then they talked about their developing of this strategy called cultivating emotional balance. And then also, interestingly, how intersecting with the Dalai Lama actually
Right.
had a big part of sort of developing a lot of this, not just in the context of therapy, but interestingly, teaching this sort of worldwide, in all sorts of different places, which again makes sense because what we're saying as human beings, it's part of our universal experience to experience emotions, and they're purposeful and they're important. So it's not just in the context of emotional dysfunction, but, being good with your emotions is part of healthiness and well-being.
Sure.
So the application of being good with your emotions and knowing what to do with them is relevant to like any human being. So I thought that was actually pretty cool too.
Yeah, and one of the things I recalled from his really early research, Ekman's really early research, right, is that he did a lot of cross-cultural study and research on understanding and really bringing into academic literature the study of universal emotions across cultures. So he's, even as a Western American psychologist, really had an appreciation for both that which is, I guess you could say, universal, but also particular to different circumstances, because he would talk about how certain emotions are, and certain facial expressions can be universally recognized, even in very different cultures. But the sort of license or encouragement to express those emotions is very different between cultures.
Right.
I don't know if so I attended the talk where they mentioned the Atlas of Emotion. I think that's different from the one that you went to, but they have this whole website, atlasofemotion, I think .com, where you can really click on sadness, anger, and happiness, and they have all these different words and show how they intersect. It's pretty, and it's done with this whole design team. And you mentioned their collaboration with the Dalai Lama, which I wasn't aware of, but they showed this interview of Paul Ekman talking with Dalai Lama, and he apparently funded that whole project. I don't know if he has personal checkbook or whatever, but I just thought that was interesting. And Dalai Lama himself basically said, like, that, even in living in a very drastically different context, he said, science is the way to really get legitimacy and the word out about what we agree on about emotions to a broader audience. And so I just thought that was a very interesting dialogue.
Yeah, I'm familiar. I did. I think indirectly they might have mentioned that. So I did see that that particular the Atlas of Emotion, which is pretty great actually. It's a great sort of teaching tool. I think some of the nuance of the research is kind of illustrated better there, because I think it talks about things that maybe we intuitively understand, that even if emotions are universal, there is still a very personal aspect as to how and why certain people feel certain things in certain moments. Sure. Whereas, for example, in this moment, some people will get angry, versus in that exact same moment, another person might get anxious. And so even though we're saying that emotions are universal as human experience, it's not a universal response relative to, let's say, context. Sure. Or personal history. And so I thought that was actually interesting to really tease out some of those details as to why not everybody experiences the same feelings for the same trigger. And that particular tool, the Atlas of Emotion, is actually really great at breaking that down, because that's specifically what the tools kind of does. You can click on a different emotion, and it kind of gives you different ways as to how that might lead out or what precipitated it, and you can kind of click all these things. And it's all research based, and it kind of breaks it down. So that's actually a great tool. I think that's something I'm probably going to encourage my own clients to kind of look at, just to kind of wrap their head around, why we talk about emotions and to learn about it. So it really is great.
Well, and it's kind of therapy 101, right? It's emotional insight. And I think some of our friends were talking recently about how just, learning the ability to name what it is I'm feeling and why is just so much blows the doors open for, especially for maybe for teens and young adults, but really for anyone who may be stuck dealing with some problematic habit or depression, anxiety, what have you. So Atlas of Emotion, check it out. Another very impactful speaker, I think, for both of us was Scott Miller. And I think, what's the name of his program? The Center for Innovative Excellence or something like that?
You keep talking. I'll look
anyway,
it up. Something
like that. But he, I think his primary interests is research on psychotherapy outcomes and utilization.
Right. And it's the International Center for Clinical Excellence.
Center for Clinical Excellence. Great. Yes. And so forget the exact name of the talk I attended by him, but basically he was sort of saying, it was something about how psychotherapy lost its magic and how to get it back. And so I hear that and I'm thinking, well, he's going to talk about why do people not go to therapy? And he did talk about that. But the long and short of, I think his message, perhaps across some of his talks too, was that, okay, here's a bunch of people in a room, hundreds of therapists who are passionate about what we do and believe in it and, take meaning in helping people in that way. But 60% of people or so who come to therapy do not return for a second session. And the usage, people coming to therapy has been on a decline over the last 20 years. So what's up with that? And he sort of said, well, typical reasons that people expect or would think to explain that by would be, okay, well, maybe there's stigma, or maybe it's due to costs, maybe it's due to the influence of drug companies and people looking for quick fix, taking medications instead of going to therapy. Maybe there's problems with the research design, giving that data. But he said, really, what stood out to him is that in that same 20-year period that usage of therapy is declining, use of psychic healers and sort of mystical artists and shamans, tarot card readers has increased, which, by the way, I didn't know about that. So that was sort of a surprising finding to me, but very interesting. And basically, I think where he went from that in his message is that therapists we're out of touch, that we're drawing off of scientifically developed approaches, and that people generally, by and large, have very complex worldviews, whether they're religious, however they identify, Christian, religious, spiritual or not. They may have views about the occult, about the afterlife, about forces that aren't replicable or observable, about how they grieve and connect with people who they've lost, and that the tendency in the scientific empirical worldview out of which therapy is derived, the tendency can be to sort of write those things off, or think of those as psychotic, magical beliefs that are irrational, superstitious, and that we're out of touch because we sort of can invalidate, if not insult and harm, those aspects of our clients. So that really gave me a lot to chew on.
Yeah, I think we didn't go to the same talk, but he covered that aspect in the talk I went to as well. Maybe some more specifics that he actually mentioned was not only has the usage of psychics or spiritual advisors increased at the same time in which usage of psychotherapy has decreased, he mentioned that even during the sort of big financial recession, there was actually a surge, right? And this is people definitely paying out of pocket for these services.
There's no insurance reimbursement for that.
There's no insurance reimbursement for a tarot card reading.
Right.
Well, actually, maybe the other sort of more compelling way that he talked about it is he actually did this study where they directly compared people using psychic spiritual advisors against therapists, against physicians, against friends. So 4 categories where people went to seek help. And even though the general consensus was everyone found all 4 groups to be helpful, the group that did the best in terms of people reporting that was helpful, that was useful, I'd go back, was the psychics, And I think that that's a pretty humbling sort of statistic that his research kind of showed, more than therapists, more than physicians, more than friends. And then his research broke down specifically why, and the different reasons were that the psychics didn't really kind of judge a person's maybe worldview, spiritual worldview. And I think that's important because, I have a view as to how the universe works, and that's a pretty important aspect of how I make sense of things in terms of why good things happen. But more practically, I think most people fall back on that when bad things happen or things that they can't explain, which is typically the moment why you would go seek help, when you're struggling, where your own tools, your own resources are not solving your problem. You're in this sort of vulnerable place looking for help. And from that space, most people have a view that says, the universe is telling me something, whether that be God or some other mystical sort of explanation. That's what people are coming with.
Sure.
And I think psychics immediately validate that, whereas, we have a disproportionately secular sort of field in psychotherapy, where more so than the population, therapists are typically more atheist, more non-religious, more agnostic than their clients. And so that's already, I think, a difficulty. And I think Scott Miller sort of speaking of this so explicitly, and not just speaking of it explicitly, in terms of the shortcoming of the field, but pointing out it's costly, that this one particular issue where we're not, as therapists, actively validating people's specific worldviews as to how life works, how the universe works, again, especially in the moment of hardship, which is when people come to us. That's a pretty big deal. And the statistic I think that he brought up was that even when people walk in the door and come to that first visit, they make it, right? So all barriers have been removed. They actually come for that initial assessment. about 2/3 of people don't come back. And so there's something to be said about what a person experiences with the therapist that only 1/3 of people say, this might be helpful for me to come back again. 2/3 of people decide somehow that it's not worth it.
Right.
And I think a big part of that is something about that initial assessment says this person doesn't get me, doesn't know how to help me, invalidates me in some explicit or implicit way. And so I think that was a pretty compelling, challenging sort of talk from Scott Miller. And it was, it was backed up. It wasn't just sort of like, we don't do this well as a field. It was, we don't do this well as a field. Let me tell you how and why. And it was very specific. So it was very challenging.
I did think that was very interesting, too. I mean, here's a guy who clearly takes science and research very seriously, right? I mean,
Yes.
he cited a lot of research and outcome studies and statistics that many of which he had conducted himself and his group.
Scott Miller's sort of body of research is the efficacy of therapy. Like that's his whole area of research, his expertise.
Well, and then where he comes out of with that is that, is sort of an appreciation for and an encouragement of that which cannot be measured, in a sense, right? And that which it cannot be observed or cannot be assumed to be replicable or universal, which is sort of maybe. I mean, he has so many different ways of phrasing it. Is it the psychic? Is it the supernatural? Is it the spiritual? Is it the unseen forces?
He calls it our super sense.
Super sense, right?
The sense that something bigger is going on here.
Right. And he put it in context too, sort of saying that, for centuries until the Enlightenment, right? I mean, who were the people that basically did what we do now? They were, the village healers, the shamans, maybe the priests, but people that were sort of considered to be endowed with some special intuition or super sense, right? Some connection to the afterlife or a different world, and that always did and continues even in a very science data research driven world and time that we live in now. That continues to be very appealing for a lot of people. So his message is really, yes, we're therapists, but we have to think of ourselves as healers as well too.
Right.
That also dovetails into the Martin Seligman. I think you and I heard him together too. Big name in the positive psychology field. And positive psychology, briefly, right, is sort of, rather than focusing on just symptoms and what are deficits and helping people overcome problems, is how do we conceive of what helps people thrive, and how do we think from a framework of what makes people's lives successful and meaningful. And just real quickly, I just thought it was a similar connection where, he really got off talking about, free will, and got back into history of, the Reformation and Arminian theology, Wesleyan. That kind of caught me off guard, but I just thought it was interesting. These two different talks, two different speakers on different topics, but they both kind of came back to some element of spirituality and theology and really bigger existential beliefs than I think in some circles maybe are given the appreciation they're due in the therapy world.
Yeah, that was definitely interesting, right? When he was like, let me break down the history of Western theology.
Yeah, right.
And then, but I think that it does speak to this idea that we are missing something when we focus too much on this sort of like super small focused, what is the problem we're dealing with in front of us? Mm-hmm. And let's start with the problem and then let's break it down. And then maybe we'll pull in all this sort of other relevant as the therapist. And I think this is the filter that maybe as therapists we need to look at, that our filters and our biases might be too restrictive relative to maybe what other people are coming to therapy with, which might be some of their strengths and their tools, right? And including, let's say, their spiritual beliefs. And so I think that something is lost when we have this very maybe too small of a focus.
Yeah.
And then, I think in different ways, from a more clinical research-based, Scott Miller brings it up in a certain way, and Martin Seligman brought it up in this sort of like meta conversation about the meaning of life, and which is part of positive psychology. That part of how people thrive is that they're connected to a sense of meaningfulness, and a sense of meaningfulness in your life is one of the highest predictors of fulfillment in life.
Right.
And so, yes, if we get away from the traditional medical model of therapy, and therapy is bound to that because Freud was a physician, and
right.
Physicians, and I can speak to this as a person who went to medical school, is a very disease-oriented model. So it takes some effort for us to shed, that orientation that we're a problem-focused kind of field. And so the idea of starting from this perspective of what are we trying to accomplish, and thinking about in the context of not solving problems, but really having people be healthy and thrive and really sort of find meaning in their life. And then once we frame it that way, then to like reorient ourselves to the problem. I think that's a very, very different perspective. And I think positive psychology has always kind of, that's been the reorientation of people who have tried to integrate positive psychology into the therapy practice.
Yep.
I'm one of those people that really tries to do that. Is let's talk about, an ambitious, positive goal in your life first. Then we can make sense of the problems as to why the problems are the problems.
Right.
So I think, Martin Seligman did that as well,
Sure.
Yeah.
A little bit of a segue then. So we also wanted to talk about, so speaking of, appreciating the whole person and shifting a view of how we see a problem, I think probably, I've talked about this a lot, probably maybe one of the major highlights for both of us professionally, but very personally as well, was hearing Dr. Daryl Wing Su, who he's a clinical psychologist, academician at Columbia University in New York, and he's really an expert on racism, and microaggressions, which is the talk you and I attended together. You and I both promptly bought his book right afterwards. Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence, which I have right here next to me. Share some of your thoughts on Daryl Su and his talk, and maybe some criticisms that can arise from there.
Yeah, I think it was the most memorable talk for sure of the conference. I think just earlier I heard him on a panel with Esther Perel, and it was one of the few panels that was trying to address cross-cultural racial issues. And so that was kind of my appetizer to Daryl Wing Su, but it was pretty impressionable because I think, on that panel, the second sentence out of his mouth was, "Is this the evolution of psychotherapy, or is this the evolution of white psychotherapy?" And so
Ooh. That had to sting a little bit there.
He made it pretty explicit pretty quickly what was on his mind. And him making it explicit, I think, was pretty powerful to kind of see something and be able to talk about and question really things that I don't think were at all inconsistent with what Scott Miller was talking about, some of the stuff that Esther Perel had been bringing up about gender and cultural issues. And so it was really intersecting. And so I think part of the impact of hearing Daryl Wing Su speak about microaggressions was at that point, I think I had been pretty primed to kind of really hear everything he was saying. And that's also to connect with, I think, a certain perspective and awareness that we have in our present culture at large, where people in general are very challenged, and there's a lot of conflict around whether or not it's valid to kind of say that people who are maybe in the minority, people who are not in empowered positions in our culture and our society, genuinely have greater difficulty and are experiencing unique hardships specifically because of certain personal identifiers, whether that be their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their sexual identity, that this is a real phenomenon that we're experiencing in our culture at large.
Yep.
And then to kind of hear Dr. Su break it down and talk about his decades and decades of research that completely validates, the cost and the hardship and the pain that people deal with, not necessarily due to like explicit forms of outright racism and violence, but the sort of subtle but persistent, unrelenting, lifelong sort of cost of dealing with microaggressions, and how he kind of really broke it down, with such detail, supporting it with examples and research. It was very compelling. It was very moving. And then the last part specifically, and this has to do with the idea of, again, representation. I think for you and I as Asian American males in this realm of psychology, psychotherapy, seeing somebody, of a generation older than us kind of doing this in a very prominent position, well established. That in itself was also pretty sort of moving and compelling for me personally.
Sure. Well, and you were sitting next to me. You knew me for a whole hour. I was like, am I going to cry any minute here? Because it was inspiring, I have to say.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting because, as you said, I mean, the focus of that talk was primarily on racial microaggressions, but micro invalidations, micro insults can happen towards women, towards LGBTQ individuals, and do. And I remember you and I looked around, and the room was pretty packed. All the seats were filled. People were standing in the back, and that was not the case for a lot of the talks, which stood out to me. And I mean, it was a largely female-attended talk.
Right.
But and probably the other thing we should mention is that I think of the about 30 faculty of speakers for the whole conference, Darrell Sue was the only person of color, certainly only Asian American. I don't recall any Black or Latin American speakers.
Right.
Or let alone, sexual minority speakers explicitly, at least. So that was significant.
Yeah, and I think that that's part of this sort of conversation. What is implicit versus what is explicit?
Mm-hmm.
And, one of his terms is, environmental microaggression, which is sort of, how do you experience a subtle form of discrimination or oppression when the environment in which you're existing doesn't represent you. And I think that that's kind of telling when, in general, as a field, as represented by, I think, the people who attended this conference, more therapists are women. I think I definitely sort of looked around, and a lot of people there were younger, in terms of attendees. I think you and I both mentioned in a very positive way, we're surprised to kind of see a lot of Asians there, where I think that's kind of, in my own mind, recognizing that there's not as many, or there's definitely a shortage of people who are Asian American who are therapists. And so that was good. We also saw other people of color there. So those are the attendees. And then you juxtapose that against the picture of the faculty year after year after year, all the way back in the sort of program that they give. And it's like mostly white older males. And there's something about that is very sort of, again, environment. That's an environmental microaggression to kind of say, here is this group of people that we are the therapists, and we're here to learn, and we want to become better. And then this is juxtaposed against a faculty that doesn't reflect, necessarily the group.
Sure.
And what does that indirectly and, again, subconsciously, implicitly kind of do in terms of the messages it sends? And then I think that was also the reason why I was so compelling with Dr. Sue, because he made explicit by saying, this is a problem, and let's name it, and let's talk about the costs as to how problematic it is and how people suffer because of this,
Well, and I think there's something kind of ironic about that observation too, which is that, I mean, therapists, psychologists in general tend to skew pretty progressive politically, and in terms of, open-mindedness, we're tend to be compassionate people. We like to help people. We like to meet people where they are, and in turn tend to be more progressive in terms of views on race, gender, what have you. And I think that was reflected in the talk. People made jokes about, current administration. Tipper Gore, former wife of former Vice President Al Gore, who's a Democrat, came and spoke. But at the same time, as you said, when you look at the faces, it seems you wouldn't guess that it's an otherwise progressively represented crowd. And I think you also spoke to that in your, we should mention, Joey wrote a piece on his blog, which I'll link to on the show notes for this episode, really kind of calling this out in a very articulate way, and even also sort of penned a a challenging letter straight to Dr. Jeffrey Zeig, who's a psychologist and was kind of the main organizer of the conference, challenging him to think about this for future reference.
Yeah, and I actually ended up sharing that in a bunch of places. One of the places I shared it with is on a Facebook group of over 5,000 therapists in private practice. Mm-hmm. And it was very well received. And indirectly, I can tell how well received it was because I think in a matter of days, the article was reposted and reshared like 200 times.
Wow. Cool.
Mostly from that group, obviously. And so I think a lot of the things that we're talking about, things I talked about in that particular blog article, I think resonate with a lot of therapists, that we do need to do better as a field in validating a lot of different people's self-identities. And that's where we can sort of reach this place where a lot of things intersect, whether we're talking about gender identity, sexuality, race, disabilities. These are all things that are huge parts of people's worldview, self-identity, lived experience, which then, of course, impacts how they experience life. And, if we're in a helping field where we're supposed to be really the expert that's supposed to be able to help people through the difficulties of their lives from a professional standpoint, we have to be able to talk explicitly about the costs and the impact, how certain people with certain identity experiences, experience unique hardship that other people who don't belong to that group don't experience. And so I think that is, it's an important conversation to have. And I think that was maybe one of the sadder sort of takeaways that I had from the conference. Whereas, I think that particular lack of messaging or lack of validation at this particular conference, and it was there in previous years. And, I think looking back, sadly, I didn't recognize it myself as much as I did this particular conference. But it's kind of one of those things that once you see it, you can't unsee it. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the, again, very frustrating and sad things about one of my take-home messages from this particular Evolution of Psychotherapy conference was that relative to these kinds of issues, it's not only not particularly evolved, it's actually somewhat regressed.
Sure.
And the other sad thing is I've made multiple attempts to try to get this particular article in front of Jeff Zeig's eyes. No response so far. Hopefully I will get one. But yeah.
Sure.
So it's kind of like crickets so far.
Right. Well, and, I think it's pointing out I don't want to say hypocrisy. I don't know if that's too strong, but sort of a dissonance. If you're going to call the conference Evolution of Psychotherapy, you think of progressiveness and forward thinking, and in turn, right, inclusion and diversity, because that's the way the world, this country, is going. And I think in general, I would like to think, again, in a crowd of 7,500 therapists, people tend to value those things. But you didn't kind of see that in explicitly meaningful ways.
Right. And pairing that with Scott Miller's sort of research, it doesn't matter how much these conferences talk about, how to be a better therapist if people don't come back. If people aren't coming back after that first session, that's a larger failure on the part of psychotherapy than sort of any sort of clinical missteps that you take in therapy. 2/3 of people are not coming back. And again, a big reason to kind of maybe stitch together a lot of things that I took away from this conference is a big part of that is that people's whole identity, is not being validated.
Sure.
And because of that, people aren't going to find therapy particularly helpful for their problems if they can't speak comfortably with a sense that they're going to be validated and seen and heard and understood by a therapist who's not openly validating their religious views, their cultural identity, the things that they experience as hardship due to their race or their gender or their sexual identity or their disabilities. Like, I think that's the problem. I think that's very, very specific as to how we can do better as therapists in our field as to how to get people to engage and stay engaged. And I think the absence of doing that will just perpetuate those terrible statistics. 2/3 of people aren't coming back.
Well, there's kind of this interesting parallel process, where you and I, as therapists, go to a conference for therapists by therapists and don't feel all of ourselves are appreciated and affirmed, right?
Right.
So it kind of trickles down from the cultural to the spiritual. How much are we at home here, as much as we appreciate other things that we were able to learn and glean from the speakers? So,
right.
Any other final take-homes, Joey, or reflections from the conference, or we got to get you back to the next Instapot recipe?
I got things to do today.
That's right.
No, I think obviously we could probably talk about things forever, and I'm definitely still mulling it over. I've had some time off here actually after the conference, and so I haven't yet had the opportunity to kind of see how some of these insights and my own learning will impact my own practice. But it's definitely spinning the wheels. I think for me, I will be a lot more deliberate and intentional about asking about people's spiritual beliefs, people's belief as to how the universe works, why they think things are happening, and I'll do it at that first session because, again, I think that's a big reason why people don't come back. I think I'm going to speak more about people's racial experiences, people's gendered experiences, people's experiences regarding their sexual identity. I plan on bringing up the impact of things like infidelity in the context of relationships, whether that's, as a kid who grew up in a family like that and how that affects people's relationships. So I think these are the types of things that I want to kind of take as lessons learned from attending a big learning experience like this as a conference, and as quickly as possible trying to integrate that into my everyday therapy practice to help people.
Boy, that's really well said. Well, I was really glad to, learn so much from the conference, but also to kind of be able to dialogue together throughout the whole thing and even kind of maybe commemorate that more here on this podcast here. And if other people listen in, welcome to hear your thoughts as well. We were able to connect with a few other therapists there and hear similar thoughts. So that was very validating and stimulating as well. So.
Yeah, I too. Yeah. Being able to debrief some real time while we're attending the conference together, and then this experience too.
That's right.
Be able to talk about it again.
Dr. Joseph Lee, you can read more of his writings and even the article that we referenced. He wrote about this conference, and are you posting the letter that you wrote to Dr. Zeig as well? Yeah,
it's part of the same article. Yeah.
All right. So all that'll be on mentalhealthiness.com.
Yes, and if anyone knows Jeff Zeig, if you can personally hand him, I'm having a hard time getting it in front of his eyes.
That's right. Let's make a connection here, please. Get the message out.
Right.
All right. Well, thanks, Joey.
Thank you so much. This was a great experience.
Yes, we'll do it again sometime.
Okay, great.
Okay, take care. So friends listening, for you, does it matter to you that at a large conference like this on something like psychotherapy, that it has more than majority group representation? Or do you think, well, as long as you can say, you have the biggest names in the field, then that's really what matters, more than who is represented? As I was thinking, one critique someone might have of our concern that we expressed here is that, well, the conference is about therapy, psychotherapy, and the reason it's a big deal is because it's taught by the biggest names in the field. And what if the biggest names really just happen to be mainly white or Eurocentric? And, okay, I think there's something fair there. I mean, the reality is, look, the, quote, talking cure of therapy as we know it and practice it today in the Western world was developed in the Western world. Freud, Jung, Klein, James, Watson, Beck, these are mainly European and American names, so at some level perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise that in this field at this time, the main leaders and names continue to be Siegel, Johnson, Miller, Gottman, Hayes, and that even if there are great people doing work from a perspective of color or gender or sexual minority status, that they may just not at this time yet have the cachet or the draw for a conference on this scale in the same way as maybe these previously established names. So I get that. But, be that as it may, I do think the conference and the field has room to grow in, at the very least, more explicitly trying to recognize the need for diversity of thought and elevate and highlight voices from the margins and from minority perspectives, even if, perhaps the primary leading voices or leading faces for now and even in the immediate future continue to reflect more of the majority. So I just think maybe perhaps it's not either or, and there are, a number of nuanced ways to balance both things which are important. But, all in all, you hear Joey and I, despite some of these concerns and feedback for improvement, I think we both learned a lot. It was a very stimulating environment. I was grateful just to be in the presence of some big names. We didn't even get around to mentioning Salvador Minuchin, huge name in the field of family systems and structural family therapy. Minuchin was actually one of the main draws, one of the main reasons I registered for the conference to begin with, but he passed away. He was elderly, but he passed away just a month or so before the conference, and so they were able to pay tribute to him with a video demonstration he did and some comments he had prepared, which was very fascinating. And we also heard there was a keynote by Philip Zimbardo, psychologist from Stanford, very famous for the Stanford Prison Study in 1971. He gave his address on a range of really interesting topics, I thought. Research on shyness, on fatherlessness and its impact on youth, especially young boys, and acts of heroism. He's got a whole project on heroism and about inspiring everyday heroes among otherwise, quote, ordinary people, and how being a hero can simply mean doing the right thing when others are not. You don't have to wear a cape or have some secret identity. So, there was just a lot of inspiration at this conference. A lot of content really leapt out of the halls of academia, and it wasn't just about therapy per se. Really just inspiring to think beyond towards transforming society and changing individual lives for the better in a broader sense. So, well, what are your impressions, fellow listeners, of psychic healers, of tarot card, palm readers, mediums? Do they carry authority in your eyes in the field in a way that the field of therapy does not? And if so, why not? Or for you, do you have more trust in psychotherapy and psychology because, there's a level of academic credibility perhaps and science behind it? Love to hear from you. And whether you were at this conference or not, whether you are a therapist or not, maybe just listening into two therapists' reflections here, feel free to contact either of us with any comments or feedback. I am as usual at martin@psychrallypodcast.com. And again, all of Joey's contact info will be on the show notes for this episode at psychrallypodcast.com/e/31, or you can reach him at mentalhealthiness.com. Next up on episode 32, I'll be talking with Mark Baer. He is a local family law attorney and mediator, so we're shifting gears a little bit. And he's going to be sharing his, what I think is a really unique and important and fascinating perspective from the legal profession about the legal profession and the culture of law and lawyers. And he'll be making a case for collaboration and sort of symbiosis between mental health professionals and legal professionals, and even more specifically, how mediation can be a great alternative for couples who are separating or divorcing in minimizing the emotional distress and potential mental health fallout for all parties involved, oneself, one's separating partner, and, oh, by the way, any children or dependents that may be involved. So tune in for that. Thanks for listening in today, and please join us for episode 32 of The Rally.